Hello! Welcome to the opera. My name is Molly and today we'll be talking about women in opera, questioning the representation of the characters and the real woman behind it. So, if we look at the top 10 operas, 6 of them have women dying at the end. Violetta from La Traviata, Carmen from Carmen, Mimi from La Bohème, Tosca from Tosca, Kerkashan from Madame Butterfly, and Gilda from Rigoletto. Outside the top 10, there are countless others of women dying at the end. These women often have one thing in common: they defy some social norm at the time. For example, Violetta from La Traviata is a courtesan, a profession which is not well regarded by an Italian audience of the 1850s, and she dies from tuberculosis. Also, Carmen, as another example, is a sexually empowered woman. She's powerful and she lets herself have many men, and in the end is stabbed to death. The more operas I look at, the more I see this common theme. So the first question of this essay is, why does opera have such a theme of killing their main women? Well, to start, if we look at Opera Base, which has over 600,000 performances on file, the most played operas were composed in the 18th and 19th century, meaning they were written for those audiences and for those social norms. Soprano Antoinette Halloran states, "Women such as Tosca and Carmen were powerfully disturbing figures to the audiences of their day. To allow Victorian women to leave the theatre seeing women like that alive and breathing in the world was somehow considered dangerous. Women like that showed there are different ways of living, that she could have lovers or choose what she wanted to do with her life without the approval of a man. So the composer and librettists killed them off, saying, yes, these women are fascinating, but they have to be punished." To add to this fact, in Why Does Opera Like Women Behaving Badly?, David Putney says, "It is inescapably tied up with the hypocrisy that springs from the historically unequal status of men and women. The men in the audience might be titillated by the first 3 acts of these operas, customarily devoted to the women behaving badly, but could take their wives and daughters safe in the knowledge that a stern moral lesson would be administered via the gruesome death of the heroine in the finale. If the titillation was sufficiently effective, the man could then say goodnight and go around to his club, or more likely an establishment where the real fallen women could be found." In summary, the audience, mostly the men, would find it easier to watch these unconventional women if they eventually would be punished, subconsciously fitting with the morals of the time. Another point to make is that opera is an art form of great emotion. In Is Opera the Most Misogynistic Art Form?, Charlotte Higgins writes, "It is as if the genre itself seems to devour women. Opera is the art form of human catastrophe, the inheritor of the mantle of the darkest aspects of Greek tragedy. The tragedy is of course not just female tragedy, plenty of dead men too, but the patriarchy makes sure that women are marked out for special cruelty. Opera, and especially the 19th century opera, allows dangerous women to coruscate thrillingly on the stage for a few short hours, then murders them." Catherine Clement in Opera or the Undoing of Women also makes the point that sometimes the music can be so powerful and beautiful that these messages, which are often misogynistic and harmful, can be overridden. In short, composers would often have their main women die to prove a moral of the day, often about the place or the expectations of women, and because these operas carry on hundreds of years later, these same morals and themes can carry on as well. It is also because of the dramatic and emotional nature of opera. Having these huge deaths on stage would absolutely create engaging performances, something I'm sure would have made more ticket sales a very strong motive for a composer. So, I'd say it's quite a well-known fact that in the 18th and 19th century, it was very difficult for women to go into a lot of professions. Not because they lacked the talent or the skills, but often the opportunity and the time. A profession in composing would be no different. So, I analysed the composers from Opera Base's top 50 most played titles, The Guardian's top 50 operas, published in 2011, which actually states that the operas are of huge range and variety, the BBC Music magazine's The 20 Greatest Operas of All Time, published in 2022, and lastly Classic FM's The 20 Greatest Operas Ever Written, published in 2022. The first 3 had not one female on their lists. The 4th did actually have one female, Dame Ethel Smith, who composed the Wreckers, and the fact that I got so excited by seeing one single female composer is quite telling of the inequality of the field. Another note is that these lists weren't just male dominated, but also very, very white dominated. So my second question is, why have white men dominated the field of opera for so long, and what is it like today? Well, it appears it's a lot down to tradition. If we go back to the origins of theatre, in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, all the roles were played by men. Women just weren't allowed on stage because it was seen to be dangerous. In the 16th century, there were still bans, leading to the introduction of the castrato voice, where boys would be castrated before puberty to keep their soprano voices instead of having any women. As time went on and these bans reduced, there was still social barriers for women. From Opera Talk, Scandalous Women, Catherine Smith states, "For most of history, female performers were by definition morally suspect. No respectable woman would become a performer. The line between actress and prostitute was considered thin indeed." Then in the 20th century, with the suffragette movement and with a lot of women working hard to break free from these social expectations, there was a lot of improvement. However, the media would still often be very critical of their appearances. For example, in The Guardian's Is Opera the Most Misogynistic Art Form?, Charlotte Higgins talks of soprano Deborah White getting gastric bypass surgery after being dropped from a production at the Royal Opera House because of her size in 2004. Another example is mezzo-soprano Tara O'Rourke, who is described as stocky, chubby and dumpy by male critics, one of whom defended himself on the argument that opera is a visual as well as a musical form, and who the male added in that the young singer had the face and figure of a goodish pork pie. So going back to the theme of female characters dying, this isn't always the easiest for female actors. In an interview for the Sydney Morning Herald, soprano Antoinette Halloran likens her feelings to a death hangover, stating when she does a season of Madame Butterfly, she's very depressed for at least a day or two after every show. Eva Kong, who played Gilda from Rigoletto, said she felt the composer thought women were dumb when she'd have to die for an abusive lover. Nicole Carr stated, "I need some quiet time after. I need to not see anyone for a little bit. It takes a lot out of you." For Herald Scotland, Lilla Palmer writes, "It's really rough on singers. If you're the go-to Carmen of the moment, you might be violently murdered several times a week. In 10 years as a professional opera singer, I watched my female peers continuously victimised by repertoire narratives, never mind harassment and other gender-based challenges in their work." So, what does the future of opera look like? Well, on Quora, David Lay writes, "I've been lucky enough to work with a number of very sensitive, often female directors, on pieces that I think are inherently misogynistic. This is an amazing experience. Discussions take place in those rehearsal rooms about how to confront or mask the sexism." He goes on to write, "But I do think that a lot of the point of opera as a living medium is that it allows us to acknowledge and learn something from the way that those men chose to represent these women. I do think it's sexist, but I don't think it has to be." In short, just because this art form has been misogynistic and harmful, it doesn't mean it always has to be. So, what's it like for opera singers today in 2023? Well, I spoke to Ava DaCosta, a soprano opera student at the Samling Institute for Young Artists, and it was wonderful to hear that Samling is quite evenly split with both students and staff. She said a big reason might be that it's hard to get young people into opera, so they've had to appeal to everyone. Something else which was really lovely to hear is that as a woman she's trekked quite well. For example, if she's being taught breathwork, the men will always ask before touching her. The main criticism though is that she notices that she's always given songs about love and death, but a lot of the males that she knows are given songs with more variety and fun. So something she'd like to change about opera is seeing women have more fun and experimental songs, not just about love and death. So, in short, opera does have a deep history of excluding women and making them feel inferior, with both character design and behind the scenes. However, it doesn't always have to be this way. People all over the world are working hard to be more inclusive and create better environments for all. The Key Change 50-50 initiative, for example, encourages organisations to include 50% women and underrepresented genders in their staff and performances, which is fabulous. So, thank you so much for watching my video, and I hope you enjoyed!